September 1st, 1575. A courier rides hard through the gates of Brussels. He carries a sealed letter from Madrid. The Spanish army in the Netherlands tears it open. Inside is a royal decree. Payment suspended. The soldiers stare at the words. They have not been paid in 4 months. Their boots are falling apart. Their families are starving. And now the richest king on earth is telling them there is no money. We are taught that Spain collapsed because of military defeat. We are told it was the Armada or the Protestant rebels or the rise of England. That is a lie. Spain did not lose wars. Spain ran out of cash. The empire that owned half the world went bankrupt 9 times in 60 years. This is not a story about battles. This is a story about the ledger, and the ledger always wins. Let us go back to the beginning. Imagine standing on the docks of Seville in 1560. The treasure fleet has just arrived from the New World. Galleons groan under the weight of silver bars, stacked like firewood. The metal gleams in the Spanish sun. Laborers roll barrels of gold coins across the stone wharf. The crowd cheers. Church bells ring across the city. This is the lifeblood of the empire flowing into the heart of Castile. Philip II of Spain is the most powerful man alive. He rules Spain and Portugal, and the Netherlands, and Milan, and Naples, and Sicily. He controls the Philippines named after him. He controls Mexico and Peru and the silver mountain of Potosí. His empire stretches across 4 continents. The sun never sets on his lands. He sits in a stone palace called the Escorial north of Madrid. It is a fortress of gray granite with 15 courtyards and 80 staircases and thousands of windows. From a small bare room in the center, Philip governs the world. He wears black. He speaks softly. He writes every order himself. He is methodical and patient and utterly convinced that God has chosen him to defend the Catholic faith. But beneath the surface, the foundation is rotting. Philip inherited more than an empire. He inherited a mortgage. His father, Charles V, spent his entire reign fighting wars. Wars against France. Wars against the Ottoman Turks. Wars against the Protestant princes of Germany. Charles borrowed millions from the great banking houses of Augsburg and Genoa. When he abdicated in 1556, he handed his son a crown and a mountain of debt. The interest payments alone were eating up 60% of royal income before Philip took a single action as king. Spain was not rich. Spain was leveraged. And leverage is a trap. Here is the fatal flaw. Philip believed the silver would never stop. He looked at the mines of Potosí and saw the hand of God. He thought this was divine providence funding a holy mission. So he spent like a man who had won the lottery. He did not live within his means. He lived within his fantasies. The silver arrived once a year on the treasure fleet. But Philip spent it 3 years in advance. He took short-term loans called Genoese from bankers at interest rates of 15 or 20%. The loans were secured against future silver shipments. He was running a payday loan scheme to fund an empire. And payday loans compound. Let me give you the numbers. In 1557, Philip went to war with France. The Battle of St. Quentin was a glorious victory. The French army was crushed, but glory is expensive. The soldiers demanded their wages. The gun foundries demanded payment for cannon. The Genoese bankers demanded their interest. Philip looked at his treasury. Empty. The silver fleet had been delayed by storms. Tax revenues were already spent. He had no liquidity. On September 1st, 1557, Just 1 year into his reign, Philip declared the first sovereign bankruptcy in modern history. He called it a suspension of payments. That sounds technical. It was theft. He converted all the short-term high-interest loans into long-term low-interest bonds called juros. The bankers had lent cash expecting repayment in months. Now they held paper promising repayment over 50 years. Do the math. If you lent a king 1,000,000 ducats at 18% interest, and he converts it to a bond paying 3% over half a century, you just lost your fortune. The great house of Fugger, which had financed the Habsburgs for generations, was crippled. They would never recover. But Philip did not care. He needed to keep fighting, so he found new lenders. Enter the Genoese. The bankers of Genoa were harder than the Germans. They were calculating and ruthless, and they understood something the Fuggers did not. A king in debt is a king you can control. They offered Philip new loans at even higher rates with brutal conditions. They demanded collateral. They took control of the salt taxes and the customs revenues of Seville. They inserted clauses allowing them to seize Spanish ports if payments were missed. Philip signed. He had no choice. He had wars to fight. And the biggest war of his life was just beginning. The Netherlands were 17 provinces in the north of his empire. They were wealthy. They were the center of trade and banking in northern Europe. They were also becoming Protestant. Philip was a devout Catholic. He saw Protestantism as a cancer that had to be cut out. He sent the Spanish Inquisition to the Netherlands. He burned heretics at the stake. He stripped local nobles of their traditional rights. The result was rebellion. In 1566, the Dutch rose up. They smashed Catholic statues. They attacked Spanish garrisons. Philip sent the Duke of Alba with 10,000 veteran soldiers to crush them. Alba set up the Council of Blood. He executed thousands. He imposed a new tax called the 10th penny, which demanded 10% of every transaction. It destroyed the economy and united every class against Spain. The rebellion turned into the 80 Years' War, and this war became a financial black hole. To get soldiers to the Netherlands, Philip had to march them along the Spanish road from Italy over the Alps through Germany. Every step cost money. The troops needed food and boots and gunpowder and wages. Spanish soldiers were the best in the world, but they were mercenaries. They fought for pay, not patriotism. If the pay did not arrive, they stopped fighting. And because of Philip's bankruptcies, the pay rarely arrived. The history of the Dutch War is a history of mutinies. The army would win a battle, then sit down and refuse to move until the gold showed up. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire was expanding west. Their fleets raided the coasts of Spain and Italy. They enslaved thousands of Christians. Philip saw himself as the defender of Christendom. He had to build a navy. Navies are more expensive than armies. A galley requires hundreds of rowers who eat every day. It requires timber and tar and iron and cannon. Philip poured millions into shipyards. In 1571, he assembled the Holy League. Under his half-brother, Don John of Austria, the fleet sailed east. They met the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto. It was the largest naval battle in history. The sea turned red. Spain won. The Ottoman fleet was destroyed. Philip was hailed as the hero of Europe, but victory brought no money. It brought bills. The fleet had to be repaired. The sailors had to be paid, and the Dutch were still rebelling. By 1575, the situation was terminal. Philip was spending 3 times his annual income. The silver fleet was mortgaged years into the future. The Genoese bankers, seeing that he was overextended, closed their purses. They refused new loans. On September 1st, 1575, Philip declared his second bankruptcy. He suspended payments again. He canceled the licenses of Genoese bankers, preventing them from operating in Spain. He thought he could bully them into better terms. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, because his army in the Netherlands was waiting for wages that would never come. They snapped. In November 1576, the Spanish soldiers marched on Antwerp. Antwerp was the richest city in Europe. It was the commercial heart of the continent. A city of banks and merchants and art. The Spanish soldiers stormed through the gates. They burned the houses. They murdered the men. They raped the women. They tortured merchants to find hidden gold. It was called the Spanish Fury. 7,000 civilians were massacred in 3 days. The city was left in ruins. The sack of Antwerp destroyed any hope of reconciliation with the Netherlands. It also destroyed the financial center of Northern Europe. The bankers fled to Amsterdam. The merchants relocated to London. Spain had just shot itself in the economic heart, and all because the king could not make payroll. You would think Philip would learn. You would think 2 bankruptcies would teach humility. But Philip was a man of absolute conviction. He believed he was doing God's work. He believed the bankruptcies were tests of faith, not failures of policy. So instead of cutting spending, he expanded. In 1580, the King of Portugal died without an heir. Philip was the nearest relative. He invaded Portugal and crowned himself king. Now he controlled the entire Iberian Peninsula. He controlled the Portuguese Empire, Brazil and the African coast and the trading posts of India and the spice islands of Indonesia. He was the master of 2 empires. But with new territory came new costs. The Portuguese Empire was crumbling. The Dutch and English were attacking it. Philip now had to defend colonies on the other side of the planet. He had doubled his assets but tripled his liabilities. And then there was England. Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant. She supported the Dutch rebels. She sent them money and troops. She allowed privateers like Francis Drake to raid Spanish ships. Drake attacked the treasure fleet. He burned Spanish ports. He humiliated the king. Philip decided to end it. He planned the enterprise of England. We call it the Spanish Armada. It was to be the greatest invasion force in history. 130 ships, 30,000 soldiers. They would sail up the English Channel, link with the Spanish army in Flanders, and invade England. They would capture Elizabeth and restore Catholicism. The cost was astronomical. It required the deforestation of entire regions to build the ships. Thousands of cannons had to be cast. Mountains of food had to be packed. Philip micromanaged every detail, from his room in the Escorial. He counted every barrel of wine and pound of biscuit. He drained the treasury. He borrowed every ducat the Genoese would lend. He squeezed the Spanish taxpayers until they bled. He bet everything on this crusade. In 1588, the Armada set sail. It was magnificent. A floating city of war, but everything went wrong. The food rotted because the barrels were made of green wood. The water went bad. The English ships were smaller but faster. They had better guns. They harassed the Armada up the Channel. Then came the fireships off Calais. The Spanish formation broke. The fleet scattered. And then came the wind, the Protestant wind they called it. It blew the ships north. They were smashed against the rocks of Scotland and Ireland. Half the fleet was lost. Thousands of men drowned. The great enterprise was a disaster. When the news reached Philip, he stared at the wall. He said God sent the wind. But the bankers did not care about God's wind. They wanted their money. The Armada cost 10 million ducats. Money Philip did not have. The investment was at the bottom of the ocean. The failure of the Armada should have been a wake-up call. But Philip was an addict. His drug was imperial ambition. He could not stop. In the 1590s, he made his worst decision yet. He intervened in the French wars of religion. France was tearing itself apart. Catholics versus Protestants. The Protestant leader, Henry of Navarre, was winning. Philip was terrified of a Protestant king on his border. So he ordered his army in the Netherlands to invade France. Strategic suicide. He was now fighting on 3 fronts. The Netherlands, the Mediterranean, and France. The cost was insane. He was spending 3 times his total income. The treasury was empty. Again. To keep the machine running, Philip resorted to desperate tricks. He debased the currency. For centuries, Spanish silver coins were the gold standard of Europe. Now Philip introduced copper coins called villon, mixed with a trace of silver. It was junk money. He used it to pay domestic bills while sending real silver abroad to the bankers. The result was massive inflation inside Spain. The price of bread skyrocketed. The poor starved. The middle class was destroyed. But Philip did not care about the domestic economy. He cared about geopolitics. The Spanish people were pawns. The Genoese bankers now controlled Spain. They collected taxes. They ran the ports. They dictated terms. They knew Philip was insolvent, but they kept lending because the interest was so high it was worth the gamble. They created a bubble of paper debt floating above the real economy. But bubbles burst. In 1596, the silver fleet was smaller than expected. The wars dragged on. The English sacked Cadiz and burned another fleet. Philip reached into his treasury. Nothing. On November 29, 1596, he declared his 3rd bankruptcy. This time he went further. He decreed that the loans were illegal. He claimed that bankers had charged usurious rates, so he had no moral duty to repay. It was royal theft. He seized revenues pledged to creditors. He confiscated silver belonging to private merchants. He nationalized a system to save himself. The Genoese banking houses collapsed. The credit of Spain was destroyed. No one in Europe would lend without physical collateral. The bankruptcy of 1596 paralyzed the empire. The army in the Netherlands mutinied again. This time the mutiny allowed the Dutch to recapture key cities. Spanish dominance in the north was broken forever. In France, Henry of Navarre converted to Catholicism. He famously said Paris is worth a mass. He united France and defeated Spain. Philip had spent millions to stop him and failed. Philip was now an old man. He was dying. He lay in his bed in the Escorial covered in ulcers. He was in constant pain. He looked at the accounts of his kingdom. He saw the ruin. He had inherited a debt of 20 million ducats. He was leaving a debt of 100 million. He had taxed his people into poverty. He had wasted the wealth of the Indies. He summoned his son Philip III to his bedside. He said, "I meant to leave you a rich kingdom, but I leave you a poor one." It was a rare moment of truth. On September 13, 1598, Philip II died holding a crucifix. The man who owned the world died broke. But this is not just a story about bad decisions. This is a story about an economic paradox. How could the owner of the silver mines be poor? How could the nation with the most money have the worst economy? Economists call it the resource curse. The influx of American silver should have made Spain rich. Instead, it destroyed Spanish industry. Because silver was so plentiful, prices in Spain were high. Spanish goods were expensive compared to English or French products. It was cheaper for a Spaniard to buy cloth made in London than cloth made in Toledo. So the silver flowed right through Spain. It went to English merchants and French manufacturers and Italian bankers. Spain became a funnel. They mined the silver and shipped it across the ocean. But everyone else kept it. Spain's economy slowly hollowed out. It stopped producing. Agriculture was neglected. Industry was ignored. Everything depended on the silver fleets. While England and the Dutch were building factories, banks, and joint stock companies, Spain was simply spending cash. It was the empire equivalent of a lottery winner: mansions, wars, palaces, but no investment. When the silver slowed, there was no income to replace it. Each bankruptcy marked another step down. Credit collapsed. Foreign bankers gained leverage. By the end of Philip II's reign, Spain's tax revenue was pledged before it was even collected. The empire ruled the world, but its finances were owned abroad. Spain had become a colony of its creditors. The damage ran deeper than money. Productive work was despised. Prestige meant church or state office, not commerce. The hidalgo emerged as the symbol of the age, a proud noble with no wealth. Cervantes captured it perfectly in Don Quixote, a man fighting imaginary giants while reality falls apart. Meanwhile, Spain's enemies learned. The financial center shifted north to Amsterdam. The Dutch built trade, banks, and corporations. Modern capitalism was born from Spain's mistakes. In his final years, Philip's silver fleet was mortgaged before leaving port. He prayed the ships survived, knowing the silver was already spent. He proved a brutal truth. Money is not wealth. Productivity is. You cannot conquer the world on credit forever. Eventually, the bill comes due.